Hey everybody, it's Chris from Xano, and this video is for all of you FlutterFlow users out there. I'm super excited today because FlutterFlow has announced support for custom authentication, meaning you can use a backend of your choice to power the authentication for your application. Today, I want to show you how you can use the new custom authentication feature with a Xano backend. We're going to go into Xano and I'm going to show you the APIs that we're using. And then we'll go into FlutterFlow and I will show you how to build this functionality. So here in Xano, it's a very simple workspace. I just have one table that's a users table, and we have one user inside it. When you add authentication to your project, Xano can generate authentication API endpoints for you. You can either do that during signup, or if you're adding it later, you can click on this Add API Endpoint button and go to the authentication category, and you can add login, sign up, and an auth me endpoint. This one is just like a test to make sure that authentication is working. I've basically kept those endpoints standard. However, I did make a couple of modifications just to make my life a little bit easier on the FlutterFlow side. So in the auth login endpoint, the only thing I did differently is I added a new step. This is update variable. And what this update variable step does is it takes the user variable, which is the user record that is retrieved when the endpoint runs, and it adds the authentication token to that user object, and it removes the password. So let me walk through what's happening here. So we get the record from the user table, and this record includes a hashed version of the password. We then check to make sure that that user record was actually returned. We make sure that the password is correct, and then we create an authentication token. When you make an authenticated request against one of your Xano endpoints, you are required to supply an authentication token to that endpoint, and that is so Xano can make sure that that user is authorized to access the endpoint, as well as only return information that belongs to that user. So this endpoint will typically only return an authentication token, but I wanted to modify it to also return that user data in the same step. Let me show you what that looks like. So we'll go ahead and run this, and you can see we are given some user information here as well as that authentication token. The same can pretty much be said for the signup endpoint. However, the signup endpoint, because you are creating a new account, there's no password returned from the get record or add record, in this case, step. So we don't need to unset the password key. We just set the auth token key instead. Now, the auth me endpoint, all this does is, again, it's more of a test or a demonstration on how that authentication works. We just get the record from the user table, and we can only get that record if this user is authenticated properly by providing an authentication token, and we return that record in the response. So let's go over to FlutterFlow and let's show you how to set this up. So I have, again, a very simple application here. I have a home page with buttons that redirect to sign up and log in. I have a logged in page, and this is the page that users will be redirected to once they're logged in successfully. I have a login page with a form so a user can log in. And finally, we have a sign up page, which is so the user can sign up to our application. The first thing we need to do in FlutterFlow is we need to add a user data type. The user data type just defines what data do we need to hang on to when a user signs up or is logged in. So we'll go over here to the data types section. We'll click create data type, and we'll call this user and click create. We're going to add a field to this. This is going to be username, and we'll make this a string. We'll add another field to this, and this is going to be email. You may have more fields that you want to add here based on the data that your application needs to function. That's totally fine. Feel free to add whatever you need here. Now we'll go over to our project settings. We'll go to authentication, and we will enable authentication. Our authentication type is custom. Our initial page is where we want the users to be when they're not logged in. I'm going to choose my home page for that. And then the logged in page for me is just going to be logged in. We'll go ahead and turn on this associate user data type, and we'll make sure our user data type that we just created is selected. Now we'll go over to our API calls. We're going to add an API call, and this is going to be for our users to sign up. So we'll call this sign up. Our method type is going to be post. For the API URL, we'll go back over to Xano, And let's find our sign up endpoint, and we'll click copy endpoint URL. Let's go back over to FlutterFlow and we'll paste that URL right there. Now we're going to go over to this body tab. For the body type, we'll choose JSON. Back over to Xano, we'll click run and debug. Let's go ahead and reset this if you have any values here already. And then we will copy all of this and paste it into FlutterFlow. We'll go into the variables section, and the variables that we need to add correspond with the inputs that are required for our sign up endpoint. So for me, I need a name. I need an email. And finally, we need a password. Now let's go back over to the body, and we can take these new variables and we can just drag them right into the spots we need them. So that should be pretty much good to go. Let's go over to the response and test section and let's try it out. So we'll call this new user. Our email will be newuser@email.com. And finally, we will supply a password. Let's test the API call. We get a success. We are returned the name, email, and authentication token as expected. So now we need to define some JSON paths. The JSON paths will allow us to access these individual pieces of data a little bit easier while we're building out the rest of our application's functionality. So let's go to add JSON path. We'll do a .name. We'll just call that name. We'll do .email. And the name will be email. And finally, we need that auth token. There we go. So that one is done. We'll click add call. Now let's go ahead and add a login endpoint. So we'll create another API call. We'll call this login. The method type is going to be post. We'll go back to Xano. Go to our login endpoint. We'll copy the endpoint URL, paste it right in there. Again, we're going to be setting up a body as JSON. Back to Xano, go to run and debug. We'll reset our inputs and then copy everything here and just paste it into FlutterFlow. This is the same exact flow that we did for the sign up endpoint. Let's define our variables. So we need an email and a password. Back into our body, and we will drag these variables down into the appropriate spots. Let's test our API. So the email is newuser@email.com. This is the account that we just created. And let's test the API call. So we get a success, which is great. Let's go ahead and add our JSON paths. These are going to be the same as the sign up endpoint. So we'll do name, we'll do email, and we will do auth token. And we will add that call. So now let's go back into our application, and we are taking a look at the sign up page right now. So let's click our sign up button. We'll go to the action flow editor. The first action is going to be under backend database, and this is going to be API call. The call name will be sign up. We'll click set additional variables here. And let's go ahead and define our name, email, and password variables for this API call. The value is going to come from widget state, and that's just going to be our corresponding inputs. So I have name. We'll do email. And finally, we'll do password. There we go. And let's give this output variable name something a little bit more clear so we know what's happening. So I'll just call this sign up. So now we have a conditional here that says if sign up has succeeded, what do we do when it does succeed, and what do we do when it doesn't? So when it does not succeed, let's add an action here. We'll do an alert. And we'll just choose an informational dialog. For the title, we'll just say error. And for the message, we're going to choose action outputs, and we'll choose that sign up action. For the API response, let's just choose raw body text. So what this is going to do is if there is, for some reason, an error on sign up, This will just return the entire error message so we have an idea of what we need to address. If the signup is successful, under true, we're going to add a new action. And this is the new feature that FlutterFlow recently added that allows this to work, the custom authentication section here. We're going to choose login so we can log in the user. We're going to set the authentication token. So that is going to come from action outputs, signup. We'll choose JSON body this time. We'll choose JSON path. And finally, we will choose auth token. We'll turn on set user data. We'll choose create data type and user. We'll add a field. The first one is username. And we can get that from the action output. So we'll choose JSON body, JSON path, and name. We'll click confirm. Let's add another field, and this will be our email. So again, we're choosing action outputs, API response, JSON body, JSON path, and email. We'll click confirm, and that's it. We are all done. We just need to make sure that we navigate to the proper page when the user is logged in. So we'll do an add action, navigate to, logged in, and we are good to go. So we'll close that. And now let's go over to our login page, and we are going to do the exact same thing. So we'll click our login button. We'll go to the action flow editor. We'll add an action, and this will be under backend database API call. This time we're going to choose our login call. We'll go ahead and set our variables. This time it will be email and password. So we'll go widget state, email, and then we'll do the same for the password. And let's change this output variable name. There we go. Let's add a false condition first. We're just going to do another alert here. We'll set the title as error, and then the message will come from the action outputs of login. We'll choose raw body text and click confirm. If it's true, again, we're going to add the same action as before. So that's under backend database, custom authentication, log in. We'll go ahead and set our authentication token from that action output. Choose JSON body, JSON path, and auth token. We want to make sure to set our user data. So choose create data type and user. We'll add our username and email fields here. So we'll go action outputs, login, JSON body, JSON path, and name. And let's add the email the same way. And finally, let's add our navigation to that logged in screen. There we go. We're all done. We've just added sign up and login with Xano to our FlutterFlow application using the new custom authentication feature. Let's test it out and make sure it works. When you're testing this, you want to make sure to go over into test mode. So we'll do that now. Okay, so here we are in our demo application. Let's click sign up, and let's go ahead and sign up a new user. We'll call this testing my app. And we'll click sign up. That just takes a second, and we are redirected to the logged in page as expected. Let's go over to Xano and let's just make sure that that worked as expected. So let's go to our database, and you can see that new testing my app user is available in our database. Now let's try logging in as that user again, just to make sure everything works as expected. We'll click log in. And there we go. We are logged in. Again, we can verify this on the Xano side. This time, we're going to look at the login API. And we're going to take a look at the request history, and we can see the most recent request made to our login endpoint. And there is that new testing my app user logged in successfully. Very cool. So the last thing we need to talk about is how do authenticated requests work in Xano? Obviously, we want to make sure that some of our APIs are only available to logged in users, and we also want to make sure that they only return information that is relevant to them. The way that works in Xano is the user is issued an authentication token, which we've now stored on the FlutterFlow side for that user after they've logged in or signed up. We now need to make sure that FlutterFlow can send that authentication token back to Xano when we need to make requests against our authenticated endpoints. So for that, we will be using the auth.me endpoint right here. Let's go ahead and copy this endpoint URL, and we'll go back over to FlutterFlow here. Let's go ahead and add a new API. And we'll just call this me. This one will be a GET, and we'll paste that API URL in there. This time we need to add a header. This is where the authentication token lives. And for this header, we'll type authorization. We'll do a colon, bearer. And then we're going to put some square brackets. And inside these brackets, we'll just type auth token. And this tells FlutterFlow that we are going to replace that value with a variable. So let's go to the variable section. We'll add auth token. And the type will be a string. To test this, we'll go back over to Xano. I'm going to click Run and Debug here. I'm going to use this little selector to choose that user that we created earlier. And I'm going to click this copy button, and that will give me an authentication token that I can use to test calling this API. So we'll choose Test API Call, and we can see that was successful. We are returned the user information as expected. Let's go ahead and add our JSON paths here. So we'll go ahead and add name and email. And we will add that call. Let's go over to our logged in page. So we want to demonstrate that the user information can be shown here. So all we're going to do to showcase that is we're going to add a button to this page. We'll change the text here. We'll say get user data. Let's add an action here. We'll open the action flow editor, and the action is going to be under backend database, API call. And this time we're going to choose that me call, and we'll set our auth token variable. Our value is going to be under authenticated user, and we will choose authentication token. This is what we set earlier when we were defining that user data in our sign up and login API calls. If this is true, we'll add an action here. Let's just display an alert, and we'll choose informational dialog, and we'll title this success. And our message is just going to be the output of that API. Let's add a false condition here as well, and we're going to do the same alert dialog, but this time we'll just change the title to error. There we go. So we should be good to go. Let's go back into test mode and we'll make sure this works. Okay, so here we are back in test mode. Let's click login and let's sign in as that user we created earlier. We'll click login and we're taken to the logged in page. So we can be pretty sure that the login was successful, but let's click this get user data button and see what happens. So you can see we get a success and the user information is returned successfully. So not only have we set up signing up and logging in a FlutterFlow app using Xano as your backend, but we've now demonstrated returning user data for the logged in user. It's pretty cool. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope this helps. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments below. You can also reach out to us via Xano support or join us on the Xano community at community.xano.com. We'll see you in the next one.